As you know, we are taking some time this fall to look at the book of Revelation. And we are doing essentially a 6-week study of the book of Revelation. This is week 2. We're looking at the various bits and parts of the book, sort of flying high over it so that we don't end up spending 67 weeks in it as opposed to 6 weeks in it. This morning we're in chapters 4 through 7. Looking at the cycles that John uses to explain to us what it is that God had put on his heart. It answers 3 questions. 3 questions you'll hear me talk about all the time. The questions are, who is God? Who are we? And then where are we going? This morning I want to talk to you about the second of those cycles. It starts in chapter 4 and goes through chapter 7. And I would call it, in one sense, the ride on the biggest roller coaster you ever possibly could have imagined. How many of you have been on one of those big old wooden jobs? You know, the ones, maybe you've been on the ones that sort of spin you around upside down, and there's a certain point in life at which I don't need to do that anymore. But I can remember, even as a child, going to the amusement park, and I guess at some point I was deemed old enough to get in the car. If you were lucky enough, you got the front seat, right? I mean, that's where you want to be, up there with that little stainless steel bar in front of you. And then the car inches out of the little loading area, and it goes up this precipitously steep ramp. Remember that? Click, 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 click. This chain is pulling you up there and pulling you up there. There's no motor on this thing. It's going to be gravity from the time you get up top to the very end of the ride. And when you get to the top, there's this pause. You are probably at the highest place anywhere in the amusement park. And you can see all around. And the car has stopped moving upward and has not yet started moving downward. You know the spot I'm talking about? Everything's peaceful. For about, 1 second, maybe. And then you feel that you're starting to move forward. Just slowly at first, but after you move just maybe a few feet, you look down and you realize, we're going to go down in a hurry here. And no matter how prepared you are for that, there's nothing like that almost sheer drop, that plunge, all the way down, down, down. Of course, at that point, at least 2/3 of the people are screaming their heads off. You probably are too, but you can't remember. And when it just seems like the ride is never going to end and you're going to drill a hole right through the bottom of the earth, then the car sweeps back up and begins to climb again, now more slowly, more slowly, more slowly, until you reach the top of the other side of that great big loop that you went down. Did it ever feel like life is like that? You have that moment of peace and joy and everything is perfect. You even maybe take a picture of that gathering, or you sort of mentally photograph it in your mind, like, I don't ever want to forget how great this is. And then you get that creepy feeling that we're moving over the edge of something, and you're going, no, 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 no. And then all of a sudden it's, plunging into a new round of chaos. Plunging into, maybe it's a new round of busyness. Maybe it's an unforeseen loss in your family. Maybe it's an unforeseen ailment or a financial reversal that maybe nobody saw coming. Or even if they did, there was no way to stop it. And here you were, maybe a few days ago, or a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, at the top of the world, looking around, enjoying the view, and everything made sense. And now you're hanging on for your life and probably screaming your head off, at least somewhere inside, as you're plunging down, wondering whether there's a bottom to this ride. Has anybody ever been there? I think we all, I thank you. I think we all know what that's like. Our world right now is in one of those free falls, isn't it? News reports come out, and the only thing that displaces the bad news is badder news. Just when you thought that things couldn't get worse, something else pops up, and something else is happening here and happening there. It gets from worse to worse, and it feels like we're just going down, 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 wondering, well, what pulls us out of that? What helps us turn the corner? And so if you're in that situation, maybe personally, just in your own world, maybe in your own set of relationships, or your own parenting, or your own thought of who you are or where your life is going, you're not alone. And that is what it is like to live in this world. We have our high points and we have our low points, and getting from the high to the low usually isn't a pleasant experience. Usually it feels like you got in the elevator and somebody cut the cable, and you just wonder what's going to happen when we bottom out on this thing. John's book of Revelation captures this reality of taking us on a breathtaking ride from the heights of heaven down into the chaos of a world ruled by evil. And then he brings us back up again. You'll see as you read the book of Revelation that there are these glorious moments when everything makes sense, when we're there with God in heaven and everything is as it should be, and our hearts are longing for that stability and for that order and that justice and that goodness and that love. And just when we think we can kind of settle down, all of a sudden we find ourselves plunging back into the darkness of this world. Think, for example, of Jesus with 3 of his disciples climbing up to the top of a mountain. And when they get there, heaven comes down to touch earth. Remember how Moses and Elijah showed up with Jesus, and Peter said, "This is great. Let's set up a campground right here. A tent for Jesus and one for Moses and one for Elijah, and the rest of us, well, we'll just hang out." In other words, we don't ever have to go back, do we, Lord? But the answer was that God swept in, and he said, "There's more to be done. Follow my son. This is my son with whom I'm well pleased. You do what he says." And Jesus said, "We're going back down." You know what was waiting for them at the bottom of the mountain? The rest of the disciples, with a man whose son had an evil spirit, and nobody could touch that evil spirit. Total chaos, total confusion. And Jesus goes from the mountaintop into the very darkest experience that a family and an individual could have, and makes things right. Not much time from the top to the bottom. The good news is that God always, in his story, brings us back up out of that dark place, showing us how he fixes his world and the people in it. So buckle your seatbelt. The ride is about to begin. This second cycle begins in chapter 4, right where the last one left off, where we looked at the letters last week, where we started with Jesus in heaven, went down to the earthly reality of Christians living in this world, came back up into the throne room of God. Now here we are in the place where God rules his creation. Listen to what John tells us in the first verses. This is verses 1 and 2. "After this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this.' At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it." If you want to use the example of the roller coaster, we're at the top of the roller coaster. We're at the highest place that a human being could ever be. John has been brought into that heavenly perspective. He can see that everything is as God means for it to be. And the picture John paints for us is one of all creation giving honor to the Creator. The first thing we meet as you read through that chapter, and it's a chapter to read over and over and let the Lord show you new things all the time, but the first thing we meet are 4 living creatures. They are hybrid creatures. They are like animals, in one case a human, but they also have wings, which make them heavenly creatures. And they are right around the throne. They are the closest beings to God himself. They represent life here on earth. In fact, the 4 different creatures stand for 4 different types of living creature here on this earth: the human, the lion, the eagle, and the ox, and so on. And they proclaim that God alone is holy. Now, one little thing to put away in your mind here is that the number 4 in the book of Revelation is the number for this earth. For instance, I've put some examples that there are 4 living creatures. We will see in a moment that there are 4 horsemen who bring who reveal God's judgment and the brokenness of the world on the earth. Later on, we'll read about 4 angels who hold back the 4 ends. The Bible talks about the 4 corners of the earth. We think about north, south, east, and west. And in fact, when John talks about the human race, he always talks about it in terms of 4 designations. He talks about people and nations and languages and tribes. And so 4 is the number for creation. And that number we see here around God's throne. In fact, outside of these living creatures are people, 24 of them, a multiple, obviously, of 4, representing the Old Testament, the 12 tribes of Israel, God's people, and the New Testament, the 12 apostles, God's new people, all standing there in solidarity around the Lord. The people, the elders, not only praise God as creator, they praise him and give us the reason why he is to be praised. In verse 11, they say, and this is humanity now speaking the greatest praise to God, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." Anchor this in your mind, that our God, the God that we honor, the God that we worship, the God that we praise, is first and foremost creator. He's the source of everything else. He does not simply inhabit a world that came about all by itself. He is not just one of many options. He is the God who created all things. That's the answer to the big question, who is God? And this is the biggest question in the entire book of Revelation. All the way through, this question is going to be asked again and again and again. Who is God in your life? Who is God in your world? At the end of the day, who calls the shots? Who really is in charge? Who can actually repair a world that has gone wrong? Every day we answer that question in the way we think, in the things we say, the things we do. Our every action or every thought either joins with the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders, or else gives allegiance to some false substitute. Frankly, many of the things that you experience in life here are designed to take you away from that reality, to chase after some false substitute that wants to gain some advantage, some notoriety, some power, at least for a temporary time. And the biggest message of Revelation is the challenge to choose to worship and honor the one true God, regardless of the cost. Now, we've passed through that fleeting moment of being at the top of the roller coaster where everything is calm, everything is peaceful, where it seems like the roller coaster car actually stopped for a second, just as it finishes its climb and before it begins to go down. But now, all too soon, we feel the car inching toward the brink. And John alerts us that not all is well with God's creation. In chapter 5, beginning with verse 1, we read these words. "Then I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne, the Father, a scroll with writing on both sides, and sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll?' But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside it. I wept and wept because no one was found who was worthy to open the scroll or look inside." Now, this mysterious scroll contains God's divine decree and God's purpose to repair a broken world. It has in it the answers to all of the problems that this world faces and all the things that we face and all the ways the world has gone wrong. Richard Bauckham writes, speaking of the scroll, it contains the secret purpose of God for establishing his kingdom. One problem: nobody can open it. And isn't that exactly the way the world is that we live in? We can see the problems, and yet when we go to fix them, they always seem to pop up in some other form. No matter how much money we spend, no matter how many wars we fight, no matter how many committees we create, no matter how many institutions, whatever we create tends to get corrupted and infected with the brokenness of the world. We may think we have it just right, but it all falls apart before we have a chance to even take it out on the road. And that's what John was saying here. The world can't fix itself. There will be people, there will be governments, there will be institutions that will rise up and say, we have all the answers, come and bow down and worship us. But the real fact is, they can't fix what's broken about this world. So as we look at our lives, and I don't know whether you've looked at your life long enough to figure out that you can't fix you, I certainly have looked at me long enough to figure that out. All of my best efforts are just something broken trying to fix something broken. And John realizes if we're left to ourselves in this thing of trying to fix a messy, broken world, We'll never get there. And he weeps and weeps. But then in the midst of his despair, John is alerted to the presence of the one person who can and will repair God's creation. In verse 5 we read, "Then one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David,'" in other words, the king, "has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." Now, the elder is speaking about the long-awaited king, the Messiah that God had promised all through the Old Testament, who would come and make things right. John hears about a lion, but when he turns around, what does he see? Well, we read in verse 6, "Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders." He hears about a lion, the ancient expectation that the Old Testament is filled with. But the reality is totally unexpected. It's a lamb, the Passover lamb, who died in order to win the battle. Of course, the lamb and the lion is Jesus, God's Son. The lamb alone is able to restore God's ruined world. And notice where the lamb is located. On the throne, the place where God alone can sit. This is God in human form tackling the problems of a human world that has gone drastically wrong. Who can open this scroll? Well, the great message of chapter 4 and chapter 5 is that God has purposed to fix his world. Now think about that when you think about what's going on in your world. When you're at the top of that roller coaster and you hear yourself inching forward and you look and suddenly you're being plunged into something you never planned for, you have no resources for, and your world is out of control, or you see the world of your kids or the world of your friends, the world of other people in your community out of control. Understand, God took that ride in Jesus and opened a way out through the other side. Now all of a sudden, once we've learned who can open the scroll, the opening process begins with the removing of the seals, and the story picks up speed. We're rushing down, and we're starting to go down for the first time in the book of Revelation into the brokenness of this world. Rather than just have the whole story happen in heaven, sort of like once upon a time, happily ever after, nothing ever happened wrong, there were never any problems. We are being pushed off the cliff, as it were, down into the brokenness of this world. The Lamb begins to open the seals. Now, the seals, 7 of them, are divided up in the way that this is presented into 4 plus 3. Remember what we said about the number 4? That's the number of this earth. And the number 3 is the number of heaven. You think about the ways that we speak of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or how the chants would go forth, holy, holy, holy. 3 is the number of heaven. So these seals, as they are broken off the scroll, talk to us about what has to happen to the earth and what the earth is like, and then bring us back at the back part of the journey back to heaven. The first 4 come very quickly, just verse after verse. We see 4 horses, 4 horsemen. One represents military conquest. One represents bloodshed, all the violence that goes with conquest. The third one represents economic disruption, which would bring about things like famine and obviously everything from unemployment to the collapse of entire societies. And the last one is the horseman of death, by sword, by famine, by plague, and wild animals. And what's John showing us here? He's showing us this is the world we live in. This is John's version of the nightly news. Turn on the nightly news, and what do you get? In between the happy news of the commercials, you get bombarded with what's going wrong in the world. The people that were reading John's letter, when they heard of the first horseman going out with a bow, would have immediately thought of the people to their east, who were called the Parthians, who we would now call them the Iranians. And they were a people that Rome could never conquer. They rode horses, they fired their bows into the army, they had defeated the Roman army, and they were like this threat that's always just over that other border. And John is saying, oh, you think Rome solves all your problems? Well, what about over there? That's never been solved. The second horseman is all about taking peace from the earth. Well, the great accomplishment of Rome was that it established peace on the earth. And John says, not so fast. Don't fall for the propaganda. The reality is that peace can be gone in a heartbeat. And what Rome calls peace isn't really the real thing. What did Jesus say to his disciples? My peace I give to you, not as the world, i.e. the emperor, gives to you. And isn't the same thing true in our day? We're looking for fixes, a fix for Iraq, a fix for Syria, a fix for Israel, a fix for this place and that. And we need to work on those things, but in a funny sort of way, the problem just comes back up again. Unless God fixes it, it's always going to be there. So as Jesus breaks off these seals, what he's doing is he's showing us how broken our world really is. He's challenging us to say, don't be complacent. Don't sit back and think that humans can figure it all out. Now, granted, we have work to do, but we are not the creator. We don't run the show. Be careful who you worship, because only the true God can fix his world. We get to the fifth seal, and here the story begins to slow down. We're at the bottom of that ride, and the car is starting to go up the other side. And now John slows things down because he's going to show us ourselves. He's going to show us Christians living in a world that has walked away from God. We read that these are people who have been slain because of the word of God and the testimony that they've maintained. And they're huddled under the altar of God, a place of protection, a place where God is present. But we read that they have a concern. It's in verse 10, chapter 6, verse 10. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" How long? How many of us have been in a place where something went wrong in our lives? We took that deep plunge from peace down into chaos. We cried out our prayers, and our prayer was, "Lord, when?" How many of you can remember wondering if God would ever come through? That is how it feels to be God's people in a messy world. I remember Greg here just a moment ago saying we can fix 100 houses, but there are 50,000 hills. And you and I can be going through this life and looking at the work that needs to be done and experiencing the injustice or seeing it poured out upon the lives of other people, knowing that God is true alone, knowing that he will one day fix his world, and yet we're in this excruciating tension in between. How long, Lord? John stops right there, and he shows us that that's how it feels. Yes, he validates us in that sense of that's how it is to be God's Exodus people in a world that isn't all fixed yet. We're in the process. Think about the person who goes through the chemo. The cancer is discovered, and you go through all the emotions of that, and then you have the surgery, and then it's the chemo, and it's round after round after round of chemo, and the question has to come up between patient and doctor: how long do we do this? And the doctor says, don't stop now. Don't stop now. You've come so far. We don't want to miss this window of getting rid of this disease once and for all. How long, Lord? The answer in John's story comes very quickly in the sixth seal. And the sixth seal brings us to the absolute bottom of the plunge into the brokenness of the world, where God is taking charge. It's a vision of the final judgment of the world. The world becomes unhinged. We read of earthquakes and solar eclipses and lunar eclipses and falling stars. These were all ways of talking about the world just coming apart at the seams. Now, we read those, and as scientifically oriented people, we're thinking in terms of planets going out of their orbits and asteroids hitting the earth and so on. Very often, however, biblical writers used astronomy to talk about earthly kingdoms and systems. Remember what happened when Jesus was born, and Matthew tells the story? People from the other side of, back where those bowmen lived, way off in Babylon or beyond, saw stars in a new place. And they did their calculations and said, that is a sign that a king has been born here. that God has established a new king here on this earth. And so part of this symbolism, as terrifying as it is to us, is really about the whole human system and all of its pride and all of its arrogance being shaken to the core and coming crashing down. We read that the response of the earthly people is in verse 16 and 17, Revelation 6, 16 and 17. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" Now, John has told us that this included the very kings of the earth, the people who had set themselves up as being gods themselves. And now they're finally being called to account. How long is the cry we're all going to have? We're going to wonder when God makes it right. And John says, don't worry. It may seem like a long time as you wait for God to repair his world, but he is repairing and will repair his world. Wherever you are right now, whatever thing is going on in your life that is not right, that is not fair, that God needs to fix, understand God will repair all things. You may live to see it in this life or you may not. Does that really matter if things get put right in the end? Frankly, every one of us, when we finish our earthly journey, we'll come to the place where when our head goes onto the pillow for the last time, the world will still be a mess. You agree? There will still be some unfinished business in your family. You could have made your marriage a little better. The world could have decided to at least have one day of peace. But don't worry, God hasn't finished his work. And so where are God's people when the end comes? And when God does say, okay, I'm now going to come and bring an end to all evil in this world. Well, at the beginning of chapter 7, we get that answer. Verses 2 to 4, we read, "Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God." A seal was something you would stamp into clay or into wax. The seals on the scroll had all been marked with this seal. Maybe there was a time when you had one of those little kits where you melt the wax on the paper and then you have this little personal seal. Well, now the angel brings God's seal. He called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power, there's the earth again, to harm the land and the sea. "Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God." And then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from the tribes of Israel. Wow, what's that all about? Where are we, Old Testament or New Testament? Well, John is saying we're in the New Testament. We're in the new reality brought about by Jesus, but what we're going through fits the story and continues the story that we read in the Old Testament about the Exodus. Remember, in chapter 5, we saw Jesus as a lamb who was slain. He was the Passover Lamb. When you read the Exodus story, you know that great plagues came upon Pharaoh, judging him for his arrogance and thinking that he was God. And finally, when the last plague came, the one that would cause him to break down and let the people go, God said to his people, you can be protected, you can be sealed from that horror and that danger if you kill the Passover lamb and put the blood of the lamb around your door. And then, as the story goes, when the death came, it would pass over you and not come into your life. Well, now John says the same thing is happening in the bigger story of God fixing his entire world. And in the same Passover lamb now is not a little lamb in Egypt, but Jesus who died for us all. We are God's new Exodus people. Now, to count the people, 144,000, that's created a massive amount of speculation, obviously. Who are the 144,000? Some religious groups have said, well, we know who they are, and once that group is filled, too bad for the rest of you or the rest of us. Others have all sorts of theories. But what John is doing is he's talking symbolically about the people of God. And when they were numbered so that they could be considered as an army doing the work of their king. And so now, instead of just being a people huddled under the altar saying, how long? John says, God is giving us work to do. We are on a journey. We're six seals along in a 7-seal story. We're near the end, and God is leading us out of that dark place that needs to be judged and recreated into his promised land. So in a sense, each one of us are part of that 144,000. James Resegi points out that right here we meet God's Exodus people in an in-between time. I'll read you the quote. I think it's up there. It is an in-between time, the point of anticipation but not yet completion of the journey. It's wilderness space, in between captivity in biblical Egypt and arrival at the promised land. Remember how we started this journey? We were at the top of the world. We could see everything. We were in heaven. Then the question, who can fix the world? And we find the Lamb can do that. But as he begins to repair the world, we have to go down and see how broken it is in order to see it repaired. And we get caught up in the midst of that going, well, how long is this going to go on, Lord? And you know, the ride back up the other side of a roller coaster is a lot slower than the one going down. And it can seem like, will we ever make it to the top? And when we're wondering whether we're going to make it to the top, John says, don't worry, you've been set apart. Set apart. In chapter 7, verse 9, we get back to the top of the other side of the roller coaster. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. Now, you remember when John was in heaven at the beginning of this story, he heard about a lion, but when he turned around, he saw a lamb. This is something John likes to do. He has us hear one thing and see another so that he can say, well, they're both true, but what you see is the deeper reality. Well, the same thing's happening here. John heard about this 144,000 people, the people of Israel, imagined the way that they are found in the Old Testament. But when he looks with his eyes, he sees the whole new human race that God has created. A vast multitude, the entire human family. You see, God's plan always was that he would bring people out of all of the human race. He said to Abraham, I'm going to choose you, and you're going to be my agent to bring repair to the world. But that's only to start the process, because when it's finished, all the nations of the world will bless themselves through you. So the 144,000 are a way of talking about us as the people of God. But it's not something restricted to a particular number. It's a symbolic number. John says, do you want the real number? You can't count it. There isn't a number for that. It's a multitude nobody can number. We read in verse 14b that the angel says, or the elder says, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes, made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Passover people. People set free from the brokenness and the sin of this world. No longer controlled by the false gods of this world. And now they stand in heaven. We read then in 15 to 17, words that tell us we've gone from the top of the world, heaven itself, down to the darkness of this world and back to the top again. Therefore, they, and this is you and me as well in God's great story when that day comes for us, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. How long, Lord? How long does this go on? Here's the answer. It goes on until God has repaired his world and brought us out safe and sound. The journey complete. I show you this whole journey here. This is the journey we've taken in just the last few moments. A vision of the Creator God, a vision of the Lamb who will repair the world, who died for our sins and broke the power of death. Seals 1 to 4 showing us how broken this world is. The big question at Seal 5, the Christians ask, how long? When do you finish the job, Lord? The answer is the judgment and the sealing of God's people, reimagined at the top of the U as a whole multitude in God's new creation. Now, in a sense, we find here the answer to our three questions. Who is God? In your life, you will answer that question this week. You'll answer it how you spend your money. You'll answer it what you watch on television, what sites you go to on the internet, how you interact with people at work, how you relate to the people that you love, how you deal with your children, how you do everything from drive your car to buy your groceries. You will answer that question, who is God? John's challenge, as he tells us this story, is there's only one God worthy of being worshiped, the one who made everything. Who is God? Take the ride. Leave him behind and go down into this broken world with its wars and its bloodshed and its economic disruption and its injustice. Is that the world we want? No. Do we want the gods of this world? John says, no, you want the one true God. Who are we? Well, we see ourselves in three different ways, don't we? We're a people that are crying out for God to come through for us, just like Israel did when they were in slavery there in Egypt. And God said, I've heard the cries of my people. Well, he hears your cry. If you're in that place where the bottom has dropped out of your life or your world right now, or where you're fearing perhaps something in the future, or you have a loved one or a friend who is going through a hard time, it's okay to be there. It's okay to join with those other voices and say, Lord, how long? The brokenness of this world is pounding in on me, or maybe tearing me up from the inside. How long till you make things right? But don't stop there, because then John says, okay, so you've identified the problem in your life, your experience of this brokenness, but look at what God has done about it. He's already promised he'll make it all right. That sixth seal says God will call everything to account. We come to the end of Revelation, we see that again with that great white throne. And he says, but for those who have put their faith in Jesus, they're set apart. They're sealed. They've already passed the test. They're already declared innocent and God's children. And then we get that beautiful picture, that picture of where the story ends. I remember when my dad passed away, there were many months of how long and why. I remember my dad looking at me as a fellow pastor and saying, Roland, why is this happening to me? I never did any of the things that a lot of other people did, that you would think they would deserve to get a cancer like this. And of course, that isn't the way the world works. And he pushed through that, but he had to agonize with those feelings. It's part of being in this world. And then came the good news that even though he would take that final journey, he was sealed and protected, brought home to be with the Lord. And I remember the Lord giving me a vision of my dad, some months after the funeral. And my dad, and it was a vision of a young man striding very purposely through the beautiful palaces of heaven. And I realized God's wiped away all the tears. Now, I'm still crying tears here because I haven't finished this journey, but Dad's safe and sound. Those of you who've lost a loved one and know that person is there with the Lord, you can rejoice with them. What do we say? A better place? Well, it's not the better place, it's the best place. It's a place where everything is back the way God meant for it to be in the first place. Who is God? Who are we? Where are we going? And the most important thing for us right now is to answer that question, what am I going to do next? Do I need to know God more fully for who he really is? Is there some work to be done in my own life? I look at the question of who I am. Am I lost? Does he know I'm here? Has he put that seal of Jesus' protection upon me? Am I destined to be part of that multitude? How does this all end? What does the T.S. Eliot's poem say? Not with a bang, but a whimper? Or does it end with a cry of joy when we're all gathered together around the Creator? Let's bow our heads together, ask if our team would come, and ask if our prayer team would come down at this time. The biggest question you and I will ever face is the question of whether or not we are the children of God. This is a big question that John is putting before us all the time in this book. He's challenging us to look at the assumptions we have about life. Look at the things that seem to be working but are actually houses built on sand. challenging us to reevaluate, as we'll see next week, to do that thing called repenting, turning around. I just want to ask you in this moment, as you've taken John's roller coaster ride from heaven to earth and back to heaven again, do you know for sure that you're seated on that ride, that it doesn't drop you off at the bottom, but rather you are God's child? You've put your trust in him. You've said, Father, you alone are God, creator of all things. Jesus, you alone are worthy to repair this world, to forgive my sins, to give me new life, because you died and you rose again. And because of that, I'm redefined. I'm a child of that great King. When this life is over, my journey continues all the way to that place where every tear is wiped away. I want to encourage you, if you have never really come to a place of being sure of that reality, that you would just come hang around here this morning. Come down and have a prayer with myself or one of the other people here at the front. And we'd love to just pray with you and have you know for sure who you are as part of God's family. It's the biggest decision we ever make. And only you can make it. Perhaps right now you're already feeling that, yep, that's something I need to do. I'm going to be waiting here for you at the front, and I know there'll be some others here too. And we can help you start that journey in the full confidence that you belong to him.